I do think, and that we're in some way realizing the triumph of the Reagan Revolution, and that in fact the radicalization of American culture through the Vietnam War and through principally the Civil Rights Movement dramatically shifted in 1980, and that the wheel of culture continues to move in that direction, and that when we find ourselves in the presence of these curious, the most curious oxymoron, the not-for-profit corporation, where the very structure that was created was designed to generate profit. And I believe that the difficulties that we experience in practice when interacting with the theaters that are structured in this way are, and I have worked with quite a lot of them actually, are very much emerge from that core contradiction. And there are some interesting possibilities, and I think, you know, I'm full of uncertainty as to how one proceeds precisely in addressing work and addressing one's life through the work. But I do think that something you said about invisibility is somehow important, meaning that we find ourselves progressively in a litany of self-publicization, in which I encounter routinely artists who have scant artistic achievement, but they have a website. And that, in fact, and you know, we can be mindful of the paradoxes that arise that question what, in fact, is art? What is a work? Is it actually a fundamental shift in how we're going to be seeing and defining artistic efforts in the future as we go forward? But I was reminded of something that I heard from Lucinda Childs, read it in some article, where she said, well, you know, when we were working in the 70s, we actually, no one knew what we were doing, no one cared, and because no one cared, we were able to grow in ways that were exciting and beautiful. And I think that there's something important about that. I believe that as we have all, and my wife, Marissa Chibas, pointed out, she continually says to me, you know, I remember a time when not everyone was a businessman. And now everyone is a businessman, and indeed, as the dean of the Cal Arts School of Theater, I'm assisting in students acquiring skills of interface with a larger environment. There's no question that is there's some facet of that I interact with on a daily basis. At the same time, the complex, the subtle, progressively begins to be satisfied or sacrificed to the protestations of identity, either the identity of the work, how we choose to market the work, and all of the attendant acts of self-definition go together with that. And hence this, I begin to be finding for myself as an artist strategies for how to get below the surface, and how to protect those things that are actually the core of what I'm pursuing artistically, and trying to find ways to nurture them. And I have to say that for me, I find it progressively more antithetical to a lot of what seems to be important to getting an audience or getting attention and what we might believe is the concomitant funding. And I think there are some essential errors in that thinking. I think that actually the possibilities of looking inward rather than constantly looking outward are actually perhaps rejuvenating in ways that are impossible for us to know, and perhaps rejuvenating in the way of creating a kind of radicalization of consciousness, possibly. And those are the things I think about. You know, it's a curious thing that I realized when I was talking to Tina earlier, that, you know, the piece that we created, Bruising Willie, is in Under the Radar, and actually we were never invited to Under the Radar. And continually just kind of pushed our way in somehow. But it was curious, and then at the point at which they published the brochure, then I called them up and asked them for some money. The thing that was true was that, at least, I mean, certainly we haven't received any money for performing within the festival. I think the resource went largely to the international companies that were invited, which I also think is noteworthy. But I do believe one thing I think is tremendously interesting to me about the environment. I've been in Los Angeles now for 12 years, and it very much reminds me of New York when I moved to it in 1979. Very much reminds me of that in terms of the critical mass of artists that are working, and I might also add where the art forms are not segregated. What has evolved in the New York landscape that has made a certain kind of discourse more difficult, and the interpenetration of the arts almost impossible, is the fact that genre has become firm. Whereas Richard Foreman would go to see Jonas Mekas, they would all be together, they all thought together. And that is actually happening in Los Angeles now in a very, very similar way, whereas in the landscape, the urban landscape that New York has become, those genres have become separate. So there isn't a discourse between experimental cinema and avant-garde theater, or, you know, in that way. So I'm very enthusiastic about what I see. At the same time, at that time also, there was no infrastructure of support for people to practice their work. And I think that one has to ask the question, and certainly we do ask it of our students on an ongoing basis, is it actually realistic to consider yourself an artist in America, and that will invariably lead you to a conventional bourgeois existence? Now, what's problematic about that thinking, I mean, this is a battle I fight in my mind all the time, is the fact that when I emerged as an artist, it was relatively inexpensive to live. and it's not inexpensive to